Next, from the Standard Club of Chicago, Senate President John Cullerton gives a keynote address on the Illinois state budget. In the address, Senator Cullerton lays out where the state spends its money, where the revenues come from, and then takes questions from the audience on possible policy changes. This address was part of a forum organized by the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. It runs about 40 minutes.
And second, in your packets today, you actually have an analysis of the 2014 general fund budget that just passed, in addition with a short special report that really tries to focus clearly on the driver of our state's long-term fiscal problems. And I know because we've had these problems for now 22 consecutive years, the state has run a deficit in its general fund, 22 consecutive years. Because we've had these problems for such a very long period of time, many people tend to believe overspending, profligate spending on services has been a major driver of these problems. Well, in fact, the data are very clear that that is not what's causing our state to have fiscal problems year in and year out. And I think that short special report focusing on the revenue side of the ledger will be very helpful. So I would like to move forward into the event now and bring forth Kathy Nesberg, who's going to introduce State Senator and Senate President John Cullerton, who will deliver our first keynote. But before I do, I want to tell you why I'm excited about this event. We have held a number of fiscal symposia over the years, and the easiest thing to do at any major public policy symposium, particularly one that focuses on taxes and budgets, is to complain about the problems. It's very easy to complain about the taxes you pay. It's very easy to complain about the lack of funding for schools or for health care or for caring for the developmentally disabled, et cetera. What's difficult always is solving those problems. Now, we at the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability believe that there are some very clear solutions available. They just haven't taken root yet. The reason I'm excited about today's presenters is you have leaders, every single one of them, who have distinguished themselves by being willing to take bold stands to actually solve problems moving forward. And I have a very strong and very real hope that the individuals that are going to present to you today will be part of the solution, not just part of the complaining. And we should start moving that way as voters and taxpayers. We should start insisting that other members of the General Assembly, other constitutional officers, join the bold leaders that we have in this room today and finally move our state forward. So on that positive note, could be plenty of doom and gloom, I'm inviting Kathy Nesberg up here to introduce Senate President John Cullerton. Kathy?
I now have I get to introduce Senator John Cullerton. John has served in the Illinois General Assembly for more than 3 decades, but John and I go back way farther than that. We were high school classmates at St. Francis High School in Wheaton, Illinois, and even then, he knew he would go into politics, and his classmates knew it too. John went on to receive both his undergraduate and law degrees from Loyola University, and after law school, he began his public service career as an assistant public defender in Chicago. In 1978, he was elected to the Illinois House of Representatives. Throughout his 6-term career in the House, he served as the Speaker pro tem and the Democratic floor leader. He was appointed to the Illinois Senate in January 1991, and a year later, he won election to the Senate, representing the state's 6th legislative district. In 2009, John was elected to serve as State Senate President. On his first day in office, he began a Senate impeachment trial that ultimately led to the removal of a sitting governor. He has distinguished himself as a leader on statewide smoking ban to promote healthy environments. He's a keen negotiator and a legislator who seeks bipartisan compromise to achieve the best policy outcomes. He presides over the largest Senate caucus in America and the largest Senate Democratic caucus in the history of Illinois. John is also a partner at the Chicago law firm of Thompson Colburn LLP. He and his wife Pamela live in Chicago and have 5 children. Following his presentation, John will take questions for 10 minutes. So please join me in welcoming Illinois State Senate President John Cullerton.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Kathy and I, whenever we see each other, we acknowledge that we cannot lie about our ages because we went to high school together. And I've known Ralph for quite some time, and I'm very appreciative of the invitation. However, speaking to this crowd is a little bit more intimidating than normal, because normally when I do a PowerPoint about the Illinois budget, most people have no idea what I'm talking about, right? Because they would get their information from the Chicago-based news media. It does not primarily, cover Springfield, much less the state budget. And when you go to other media markets throughout the state, it's quite the opposite. Everybody knows who their state senator is, they know who their state representatives are, and the state budget is much more a part of their economy, and as a result, people are more knowledgeable. But when we talk about our budget, most people have no idea. And so my wife actually is the one that got me, she said, I used to talk about the budget, and she'd say, well, you got to do PowerPoints because nobody's going to be paying attention to you, so you got to have pie charts. She's really big into pie charts. So we will have some pie charts for you folks if you'd like. The other thing that is interesting is that I was in the state capitol and the legislature for 30 years before I became the president of the Senate. And typically, just like the people that live in the Chicago media market, the legislators aren't as informed about the budget unless they happen to be on the Appropriations Committee. So I'm talking about the Chicago area legislators. So I, quite frankly, never really had to focus on the budget, other than some things that were particularly interesting or of a nature to our district, but not the general state budget. And Kristen Richards, who's my budget and policy person, had to sit down and kind of educate me, and I would say I know about a third of what I should. And therefore, there's people here who know more than I do, so it's kind of embarrassing to have to try to give a speech when you know more than I do. But we will start and try to do what I can. I think in order to talk about what we did this last week, it's better to talk about what we did, what we were confronting in the beginning of last year. So the fiscal year 13 budget, which was a year ago, reduced appropriations for general state aid, for early childhood and other education priorities. And it was a very difficult budget to pass as a result of that. Keep in mind, our caucus, we did not have 40 people in our caucus then, we had 35. We have 10 African Americans, we have 4 Hispanics, we have, I think, 8 downstaters, we have folks from the suburbs, we have the most diverse caucus. And to get folks to reduce appropriations for school, early childhood, and higher ed is not easy. At the same time, we passed major changes to the Medicaid program. Called the SMART Act, and that involved the only fun part for me was raising the cigarette tax, because I like to raise the cigarette tax because I don't smoke, for number one, and number two, we know it saves an enormous amount of money, and it keeps people, young kids, from starting, and saves lives. That was part of the Medicaid package, but it involved some tough votes, and of course at the outset of the fiscal year. We have certain parts of our budget, which we'll talk about later, that are driven by a formula. And so they're liabilities. They're there. And just because you don't authorize enough spending to pay them doesn't mean that you've cut the budget. It means you're creating old bills. And so that's what we were confronted with last year. And there were certain human service programs, community care programs, for example, or our own state group health insurance program, where we had not been appropriating enough money. We also had, of course, the pension, the growth in the pension. Every year, it seems like it's almost $1 billion that increases. That's why we've been focusing on pension reform, because it's been crowding out other areas of state spending. You know, the ironic thing about the pensions is that the pension fund is not going bankrupt. We have a law that we're following that puts money into the pension fund every year. There's a certified amount. It's a continuing appropriation. And it's going to get in there, and the pension system, if nothing changes, is going to be 90% funded by 2045. The problem is not the pension system, it's what's left over for the rest of the budget, and that's the crowding out that everybody is aware of. I mentioned the state group health insurance benefits. We knew that there was a contract that was being negotiated by the governor and the various unions representing state employees, and we had a law on the books that we had to repeal. It was Senate Bill 1313, and that dealt with kind of a guarantee of certain health care benefits that we had put in the law, which we wanted to remove from the law and allow for the union negotiators and the governor to negotiate, and that was done. So, and also a year ago, we didn't know, we had a modest idea of how much our revenues were going to be. After all, when you do a budget, you're only, making educated guesses out of how much money you're going to have in the future. So an April surprise this year. We didn't anticipate that back in a year ago. So just last week, we were finishing up the end of the fiscal year 13 budget, and the April surprise was about $1.2 billion that came in as a result of the federal fiscal cliff and forced folks to sell some assets at the end of the last year, and it resulted in us having a big increase in revenues. So we then did supplemental fiscal year 13 supplemental appropriations over $1.2 billion, and what we did was to pay down old bills. That's what we did with the money. So the CCP program, Medicaid, and even governments that we owed money to got paid faster. So DOMI estimates we will end fiscal year 13 with over $2.3 billion less bills on hand, something that you would not read in a Tribune editorial. Fiscal year 14, we had some pressures. So the pension cost went up again. I think it was $900 million in general revenue fund. The GRF payment is 17% of the budget. And remember, we had to borrow for those two horrendous years, the worst years in the history of the states in terms of our income during the recession. We had to borrow to make our pension payments. Probably a pretty good idea to borrow at low interest rates. The stock market has more than doubled since we did that. But we're in the midst of paying off those old bills, that old borrowing. So when you look at, in buying the two, the pension benefit, the pension obligation plus those bonds is 22% of our budget. Now our goal, the Senate Democrats, when we started our budget negotiations, was to first look and see, you start with what the governor proposes. And to be fair, the governor, he didn't know the April surprise was coming when he proposed this budget. So we had wanted to increase state aid by $150 million. And that's so that we can get back to the same percentage of the foundation level that we had been at the previous year. We also had a lot of folks in the state Senate care about the school transportation line item, and that had been cut, so we wanted to reinstate that. And higher ed has been one that's been suffering from this crowding out for years. As a result, there's been tuition increases, as folks know, and the governor's budget had started off with 4.5 to 5% cuts. So again, our goals involve maintaining the 89% proration, of the foundation level, trying to hold the line on school transportation funding level and early childhood funding, and fully fund social service programs at their estimated liability. In other words, don't create any new old bills. So we get to Pam Cullerton's pie chart. This is our fiscal year 14 general revenue funds by source. This is where we get the money from. This is it's worth noting, of course, that the personal income tax is 45%. The corporate is 8%. I think when the largest income tax in the history of the state of Illinois was passed in 1970, the percentage of corporate was about 20%. You see the sales tax. Keep in mind that in Illinois, the sales tax is 21% of the total. It's worth noting that we are one of the states that we have very few sales taxes on services. So virtually all the states, every state has sales tax on services, much more than we do. The other sources of revenue would be utility taxes or gaming or cigarettes. That's that 15%. And the federal receipts are the Medicaid matching dollars. And the total's over on the right there. Now, that's where we get the money from. I have to kind of add this. When we talked about the income tax and how much we get from the personal income tax, it's good, I think, to compare our income tax to other states in the Midwest. So, let's see. The first one is that Iowa? You see it's graduated, but you can see real quickly it gets up to 9%. Then we have Scott Walker. That would be Wisconsin. The guy that wanted us to move to Wisconsin because we raised our income tax to 5%, he's quickly at 6.5% and then up 8%. Missouri, that's a flat 6%. When we debated the when we debated our Illinois income tax, one of the senators said, I had represented Missouri was 1 percentage point higher than us. And he said, that's not true. Missouri's got a graduated tax. If you can see, it starts down there at like 1%. It's only if you make more than $10,000 a year that you have to pay 6%. So I conceded that I was wrong. So that's Missouri. And the reason why I mentioned Missouri is because my law firm is based in Missouri, so I pay Missouri income taxes, and it's higher than Illinois. Okay, the next one is Kentucky, just about the same. And there's Illinois, 5% flat. And then we have the great state of Indiana, which we get compared to a lot. Now, Indiana has a tax rate that includes the average county tax rate of 1.28%. So when folks say that Indiana is 3.5% and we're 5%, they forget that Indiana has this county. In fact, some counties are actually higher than Illinois, and they tax retirement income, which we don't, and they have sales taxes on services. So if anybody tells you Indiana's got lower taxes, not so much. And then that's what we're going back down to. So on January 1st, 2015, you can all celebrate because we're going to be at 3.75%. So that's about $5 billion difference between the two red lines. So next year when people are running for governor, I'm not running for governor, but when the people who are running for governor are running, you might want to ask them about that gap. That's that $5 billion difference when the income tax comes down. And it happens by operation of law, okay? It's not, quote, temporary, as Mike Flannery likes to say. We'd have to pass a law to make it go up, okay? And we've done that before. We did that, remember when Governor Edgar ran against Attorney General Hardigan? And he was that the Republicans said, I think we should keep it at the higher level, and he won the election, and we had to go in and vote to raise it, if you will, from what it otherwise would have been, 2.5% up to 3%. So if we're going to change that 3.75, it's going to have to be someone voting to raise the tax, because otherwise it goes down by operation of law. Now, the corporate tax rates, you can see we're at 7%. And that also is going to go back down on January 1st. I think it's just under 6%. Now, the reason why I put this up is that this is kind of a apples to apples argument that I think is worth noting. Whenever you read in the a lot of publications, they will say that Illinois' corporate income tax is 9.5% because they add the 2.5%, which is the corporate personal property replacement tax. I say replacement tax because we don't have a personal property tax. Okay? If we had a personal property tax, we wouldn't have to have a personal property replacement tax. So apples to apples, this is our tax rate. So the point is, many of these other states have personal property taxes, we don't. Now, back to our budget. The way to look at the all funds budget is, this is another thing that most people have no idea about. What do you mean our budget's $71 billion? I thought it was $35 billion. Well, the $35.4 billion is the general revenue fund budget in green. The $8 billion in blue, that's the federal money we get, which we use to run a lot of state programs like the EPA or the Department of Employment Security. And then the red are fees and fines, and we use some of that to run some state departments. But those are all of these little checking accounts that we have, which is, you know, $27 billion. And this is where people can rightfully criticize us for not having a lot of transparency. And so if you collapsed all of those funds into the general revenue fund, it might be easier to follow our budgeting. But of course, the folks that pay the fees or that pay the fines, they want that money to go into those places where they know that the money will be there. Although there's been times when we have taken money from those other state funds. The recent Supreme Court case said we can do that because, after all, it's money we collected for state government. And so we sometimes try to pay part of our budget by these other state funds. And that's where the conflict is, because sometimes folks say, you know, insurance companies, you know, we want to make sure the money's going to the Department of Insurance. And so that's where you get the fight. Now, but let's focus on the general revenue fund budget. The red is the discretionary spending. These are the areas that are driven by law. They're determined by a law or a formula. So we call them discretionary. Actually, that's switched. It should be non-discretionary, right? So I think unless I got my pie chart switched, that should be non-discretionary on the right. But they're almost equal, so we can make the point when we go through the next slide. The next slide is the actual pies of this year's budget. So let's start at the lower left-hand corner. This is Medicaid. This would be the Medicaid program. We saved an enormous amount of money when we passed the SMART Act. It's 23% of our total general revenue fund budget, and of course it's driven by a formula. If you want to get savings in Medicaid, you got to pass a law, which we did. We reduced some benefits, we changed some eligibility rules, we raised the hospital assessments, we made some changes, and that is what we appropriated this year. We'll look at pensions. That's that 7% of the budget, an extra $900 million this year, and the debt service is 5%, so it's a total of 22%. The others are debt service on capital bonds and statutory transfers out. Statutory transfers out, half of that is the local government distributive fund. So a per capita distribution to counties and cities of a percentage of our income tax goes out in the statutory transfers out. Now the mayors who might be here, or the mayors, or former mayors, or county officials, many of you think that that money is actually guaranteed you from maybe the Constitution, and that's not the case. It's actually a law that we could change. And it's been proposed that we give you less of that money and say, hey, we're broke here, we want to pay our whole bills, we're not going to give you so much money. That's what Governor Christie did, by the way, when he got elected in New Jersey. He took all the money from locals and said he cut spending. So, but of course, if you cut money that goes to local governments, there's things like police and fire and other services that those cities perform that would be adversely affected. But that's what that money is. It's, what is that, about $2 billion? Yeah, a little over $2 billion, okay? We give it out to local governments, and I think the RTA and downstate mass transit are the other items. So those are the parts that go out the door, okay? That's the part that we have to pass a law if we were going to wanted to spend less. And so the rest on the right side is what we have left over. So government services and public safety and regulation, that's basically, you know, the prisons and the state government. It's always interesting to point out that that's a real small percentage of our total budget, right? We're kind of a big pass-through agency. In fact, when you count all of the other state employees that, you know, work, that provide the services for Medicaid, you only have a total of about 11% of our total budget that goes out for the actual operation of state government. And we have the lowest ratio of state employees to population in the nation. We have the lowest ratio of state employees to population in the nation. So, when folks say, you know, cut the waste, okay, where would you like to start? Okay, human services, you know who these are. These are folks that are not-for-profits and provide vital services for seniors, for disabled kids who are usually non-union, primarily all non-union, don't have a lot of money from year to year, and we give them contracts and they provide those services. And they've been getting, as Ralph has documented, they've been getting dramatically reduced as a percentage of the total budget over the years. And then we have our school, P12, 19% of the total. Actually, when you add the, you know, that's why when you compare schools to pensions, you can almost say pensions are higher. And then higher ed, 5% of the total. So we've been, you know, the stuff on the right has been getting squeezed as we've had to reduce, increase our payments to the pension system. So what do we feel like we accomplished this year in our budget? Well, first of all, it's balanced. Now, this is a word that, you know, people can have different meanings for what's balanced. What I would say is this. How can you say it's balanced if you still owe a bunch of money? And we still do. Here's what I would say. In the next 12 months, we are anticipating a certain amount of money. We have authorized the ability to spend a certain amount of money, and we're going to have a certain amount of obligations. We have covered all those obligations. We're not going to spend more than we've authorized in the next 12 months. And hopefully, at the same time, we can pay down some of those old bills. And we did that by relying upon eliminating those liabilities in fiscal year 13 through that supplemental because of that surprise. We do get education back up even more than the previous year, which I think was the first time in 5 years. We've increased human services by, again, paying those liabilities, providing enough money for those liabilities. And that, I think, is going to give them some predictability. They just want to know when they're going to get paid. So with that, I would be happy to stop and be open for any questions if we have enough time. And once again, thank you for inviting me today. Ralph. So, yes? I think there's a microphone here if you want to. You're asking about the April surprise?
You explained it as part of the fiscal cliff from the federal government, and you said we got an additional $1.2 billion, but I was under the impression that the federal fiscal cliff or sequestration caused less money coming to the states.
Leading up to last year, the federal, the uncertainty among folks that had some assets was whether or not the income tax was going to go up. They thought the tax rates were going to go up after the fiscal cliff, so they sold a bunch of assets, creating a taxable event. That was in last year, let's say last November. Okay? You can tell from the look on your face I'm not doing so well. And then when they filed their income tax this year, in April, they had to pay higher taxes because they they had sold assets the previous year. And that was a surprise. That's one of the reasons why the federal deficit went down, big increase in revenues. All the states had an increase in revenues, and not just Illinois. So that's what happened. At least that's what we think happened. In either case, we got $1.2 billion, and we spent it. We authorized it. Yes. Senator Oberweis, how are you?
Fine. Senator, if I could just add a comment to go a little bit further with that. Obviously, we had a situation where business people and investors looked at the fact that federal rates were going to be increased this year, so there was a tendency to want to realize more capital gains last year than they otherwise would have. And on top of that, small businesses probably had a tendency to postpone some deductions that they might have taken last year to be able to deduct them this year, or realize less income last year than they might otherwise. So pretty much across the country, as you were just saying, there was an increase in reported income, which meant an increase in taxes received by the state of Illinois in April. And I believe that our budget people expected that, anticipated that, and understood that. But what might have been forgotten is that for those who have earnings primarily through S corporations or LLCs, their tax payments are generally not through withholding, but rather through estimated payments. Mm-hmm. And as a result of having to pay higher taxes for 2012 income in April of 13, they were also, to get into the safe harbor, they have to pay 100% of the 2012 liability in the 2013 estimated payments. So not only would we get an extra bump in April of 2013, we should get a further bump in June and September and December, January. However, and I hope people keep this in mind, particularly our comptroller and anybody who's thinking about spending the extra money, that all reverses come April of next year, because people then will have already paid estimated taxes, will not have to make regular payments, and their estimated payments will be decreasing. So I hope people don't get too excited about this surprise windfall, because it's temporary and it's going away.
Right. I wanted to introduce as a state senator, freshman this year, and has been a great member of the Senate, and he is much more qualified in explaining the mentality of people with assets last year, and what their thinking might have been had they wanted to minimize their tax liabilities. And so he did a much better job than I did in explaining that. Wherever you want to go, the lady with the mic is in charge. You have to raise your hand to her, not me. I don't have a mic.
Thank you for your comments. In the governor's budget, he mentioned that you guys were honestly and balancing the budget, and you also mentioned that you're going to use the 1995 payment schedule, which I believe the SEC said was a fraudulent schedule because it seriously underfunds the pensions. So are you not really balancing the budget using a dishonest pension schedule?
Well, they might be talking about the 1995 law, which says that we have to be 90% funded by 2045. What some critics of that law said was that it was a ramp to get us to 90% funded by 2045, starting in 1995. The argument against it was that the first 10 years, the ramp was too low, so that we actually underfunded the pension fund by law. And it was only 10 years later, in 2005 or so, when that ramp started to go up. And that's what we're under right now. So I think what the governor was saying is, you made your statutory payment. You didn't have to go out and borrow it. You made your statutory payment, which was about $1 billion more than the previous year, and next year's going to be another $1 billion. So I think that's what they're referring to. The fact is that we are on a path, if we follow this law and don't change it, to pay money into the pension fund. The problem is that it's just an enormous amount of money, and it crowds out the rest of the budget. So it's honest to pay what the law requires. It now is past that underfunded ramp, so now we're paying, what the actuaries would probably say we should pay. Now, there's other ways of restructuring that payment, which is something which this organization has proposed, and We're also talking about lowering our liabilities, obviously, to the pension system, which would change how much you have to pay in, cut down on the crowding out. I'm looking for our lady with the mic. Yeah. So, well, he actually knows what he's talking about, but more than I do. I told you it's an intimidating crowd.
The SEC did not evaluate the state's pension payment schedule. The SEC has no role whatsoever in terms of the state's pension systems. What the SEC did was issue a ruling that certain disclosures in certain bond issues that the state issued did not fairly represent potential risk from that. But they gave no opinion at all on the propriety of the pension repayment schedule.
Great. Thank you. And that's true.
Senator, you've made a very thorough case that Illinois government is as lean as it can possibly be, and that we have a lower tax liability than any of our neighbors. So why is it that the state legislature has not considered and then passed either a transactions tax or a tax on services?
Well, I would think that there's going to be a time, since there's a governor's election, it's almost impossible to pass any major tax without the governor's support. Transaction taxes are controversial, but there's other sources of revenue that people consider. There's a whole bunch of loopholes. In fact, the state senate has closed a few to raise money. That should be in the mix. I got in big trouble once even mentioning that we don't tax retirement income, so I'm not going to say that this time. But it seems to me that the timing on all this is hopefully there'll be a dialogue next year during the governor's race, whoever are the nominees, and leading up to the primary, where they're going to explain how, if you go back to that chart, how are they going to make up for the $5 billion in reduction once the income tax goes down? I mean, I'm just asking, right? That should be the discussion, including the Democrat, right? And Governor Edgar proved that you don't have to lie, you know. I mean, you can say, we think we should keep it at a certain rate, and it might be higher than what it otherwise would be, and you can still win. So that would be the time to do a grand bargain, if you will. Many people have said the sales tax, the interesting thing about folks talking about other states having lower taxes, I'm tired of Florida instead of Illinois. Florida doesn't have an income tax, but for retirees, neither do we. But they have sales taxes on everything that we don't. So it's actually cheaper to retire in Illinois. It might not be as warm, but it's actually cheaper to retire in Illinois. So, but those are the things that people they're not even aware of them. So many folks have talked about the sales tax, expanding the base, increasing it to services. You know, you buy oil for your oil change, you don't pay sales tax on the service. Expanding it like other states. We actually did that in the Illinois State Senate. We passed an income tax, I think it was 3 years ago, 2009, that expanded the sales tax on services. And all we did was to cover every state that touches Illinois, and we just said we want to tax services that they tax. And I think it raised something like $700 million. So it can be done as long as it's part of a big package.
Final question for the Senate President.
Noticed on your chart that Illinois is the only state of the Midwest states that has the flat income tax. Everybody else is graduated to some degree. Do you think there's any appetite for looking at that? Because that's one of the issues that creates our structural deficit is, you know, the inability to...
Well, first of all, it's number one, it's difficult to do that because you need a constitutional amendment, number one. Number two, back in 2009, in addition to having the sales tax be expanded to cover some services, we also made it more progressive. I think we had a family tax credit, and we increased the earned income tax credit. In fact, I remember working with Ralph on that, and I think we made it really pretty progressive, much more so than you'd be surprised how much you can get out of that by increasing the exemption, and add a family tax credit, increase the education tax credit, and the earned income tax credit. So I think that we could avoid having to go through the whole rigmarole of a constitutional amendment. I don't think we have the votes for it as well. So, once again, thank you very much for inviting me.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.